Okay, and now we have a young man who, in his clear and charming voice, says, "How did everything begin?" In other words, he is asking a 400-year-old man who has no doubt been telling the story of the most exciting thing that ever happened in his life several times a week for the last 400 years to tell the story again. What you aren't told in this introduction is that the old Pythir men killed their impertinent young question-asking Pythir offspring for asking that stupid question. Yes, and then, we have an even bigger problem, because we have Patrasius, who is clearly delighted to be telling the story again, and then we have a narrator who is going to write down his words as he spoke them and tell them to us. The patrician must die because the patrician doesn't matter. Okay, move on. We'll go over the reasons where things went wrong here. Okay, fix number 1 is to tell the real story. Who is the main character of this story? Is it the nearly invisible first-person narrator who's telling us that he's going to write everything down for us? Is it the 400-year-old Patrasius? Or is it Patrasius when he was young and strong and daring? Ask yourself, when you are writing a story, what story am I really telling here? Fix number 2. Focus on the reader. In this story, does the reader care about goat cheese, backstabbing politicians, or young men with annoying questions? Do you care about them? When you read this, were you thinking, oh yes, tell me more of that? Or were you thinking, get to the good stuff? When you are writing, ask yourself, what part of my story is the good stuff? Which part am I impatient to write just so I can find out what happens next? When you have answered that question, only write the good stuff. Ever. Never write anything that you don't think of as the good stuff, the stuff that you personally are waiting to write. Fix number 3. Never ignore human nature. Stories get old. A story told by someone who has been telling it for the last 400 years is going to cause lemmings and cattle to stampede off cliffs. So, what you do to avoid this, to make sure that you do not ignore human nature, is this. You put yourself in the situation of one of your secondary characters. In this case, someone in the audience. And you ask yourself, if this were me, if I had gathered to sit in a room with a bunch of people I can't stand to hear an old man tell an old story, what would I do? And the biggest fix, the problem of the undead patrician. This is what's called a frame story. And frame stories were old when Shakespeare used them, when he set up an introduction to his story with people in the play getting ready to watch the play. What a frame story does is the same thing that a frame does with a picture. It separates it from the real world around us. It reminds us that what we are about to see is just a story. When you are writing fiction, your job is to get the reader's mind off of the fact that what he is reading is just a story. Your job is to make it real. Framing stories were labored and painful when Shakespeare wrote them, and they have not aged gracefully since. Start with the story. Do not start with a story about the story. Okay, so if we are going to fix this, what we would do, what one possible fix would be to start with Patrasius, not when he is 400 years old and telling us for the billionth time what he did when he was 16, but to start with Patrasius when he is 16. Here's my intro sentence as an example of what could be done with this. Patrasius, 16 and terrified, shifted in his ill-fitting armor and stared at the centurion. He was going to battle for the first time, and death rode on his shoulder like a carrion crow. Right there, you are in the action. You are not hearing something that is about men and myth and story, and it happened 400 years ago, and it's told to you by a person who was sitting, listening to another guy tell it to him about something that happened 400 years ago and maybe happened to him or maybe happened to somebody else. Let's go on. In the case of the Undead Patrician, you've seen 4 major writing mistakes. The first is a viewpoint filter crash, having one character write down a story told by a second character about events enacted by third characters 400 years earlier. This is a big, big problem. Second, a priority crash, being 3 steps and 400 years away from anything remotely interesting happening. That's too far. You want to be 11 seconds away from what is happening. And maybe that's even too far. Maybe you want it to be happening right freaking now. Okay, third problem, a human nature crash. Forgetting to figure out what the writer would do in a similar situation, in this case being herded into a room with a bunch of people you can't stand to listen to some guy 400 years old tell an ancient story. Fourth, a structural crash. Starting with a framing device instead of the actual story. Always start with your story, and always start with the action and the conflict right in the middle of the heart of the coolest stuff that's going on. I do writer crash tests because all writers make mistakes, but working writers learn how to fix them. My name is Holly Lisle. Watch for more writer crash tests from me, novelist, writing teacher, writer crash tester, at writercrashtest.com.